For a generation, the face of evil had a name. It had a face. It had a throne. Palpatine. He was a tangible, comprehensible monster. A serpent who poisoned a republic with whispers. He brought a galaxy to its knees with lies and fear. He wasn't just a ruthless emperor who ruled with an iron fist. He was the mastermind, the architect of suffering. He was the true final boss of a conflict that spanned the stars. But what if the most profound, the most chilling evil in the galaxy isn't a man at all? What if it's not a political force you can debate, not an ideology you can dissect, not a rival you can assassinate? The real, soul-crushing nightmares can't be found on any galactic map. They can't be challenged in any Senate chamber. They are things that can't be fought with a lightsaber. They are things that laugh at the concentrated firepower of an entire fleet. They are things that operate on a scale so vast, so alien, that they make a single man's ambition, however monstrous, look like the tantrum of a child. This is a terror. That goes beyond ambition. It goes beyond hatred. It goes beyond any human emotion we can name. Now, this isn't to say the Emperor wasn't a terrible tyrant. He was. His evil was absolute. It was a crushing weight upon 1,000 worlds. But it was also, in its own horrifying way, contained. It was a human evil, a familiar evil. It was born of greed, a lust for control, and a profound sadism. We understand that. The Star Wars galaxy, however, is ancient beyond our reckoning. It is vast beyond any sane measure. In the deep, silent spaces between the stars, there are whispers of evils. In its lost histories and forbidden legends, those evils are scratched onto the walls of dead temples. They are evils that make a Sith Lord's reign look like a simple, brutal act of bullying. They are not mere men with plans. They are concepts given form. They are entities that defy the very rules of the universe itself. Their existence renders the political squabbles of empires and rebellions utterly insignificant. Today, we are going to dive into two of those primordial nightmares. First, we will confront a physical, biological horror that rendered the Force itself irrelevant. We will talk about an entire alien species that existed not as life, but as a gaping, screaming void in the fabric of reality. They are the extragalactic, invaders known as the Yuuzhan Vong. And then we will gaze into the abyss at a cosmic entity. This entity was not a user of the Force, but a living, weeping wound within it. It was a being of pure, shrieking madness. Its emergence was so catastrophic. It forced the Jedi and the Sith, eternal enemies, to unite in a desperate, unholy alliance. We speak of the creature of pure chaos, the mother of all terrors. She is known as Abeloth, but we have to start somewhere. We have to start in a place of relative comprehension. We have to start with the invasion that didn't just challenge the galaxy's defenses. It broke its fundamental rules. It was the invasion that left Jedi Masters trembling. They trembled not with fear of death. They trembled with the terror of irrelevance. It was the invasion that didn't destroy planets with lasers, but with a conscious, living will. We begin with the story of the Yuuzhan Vong. Chapter 1. The Force's blind spot. We begin with the first nightmare. Not a shadow, but an absence. A physical horror that made the very concept of the Force a useless prayer. An entire civilization, a species that existed as a walking, breathing negation, These were the invaders who came not from a rival sector, but from the terrifying emptiness between galaxies. They are the Yuuzhan Vong. To truly grasp the depth of the terror they brought, you must fundamentally understand the soul of a Jedi. For thousands of years, the Force was not just a tool. It was a constant. It was the very bedrock of existence. It was a flowing, luminous river that connected every living thing. It connected every rock and every star in the galaxy in a grand cosmic symphony. To a Jedi, the Force was more real than sight or sound. It was a sixth sense. It was the feeling of the cool floor beneath their feet. It was the breath in their lungs. It allowed them to feel the fleeting joy of a child on a distant world. They could sense the simmering anger of a stranger across a crowded cantina. They could feel the echo of a coming blaster bolt before it was fired. They could sense the malignant intent of an assassin hidden in the dark. This intuition, this connection, was their greatest shield. It was their most precise weapon. It was their very identity. But all of that, every ounce of that power, was utterly, completely, and terrifyingly useless against the Yuuzhan Vong. They were invaders from a different reality, a galaxy untouched by the Force as the Jedi knew it. They were utterly and absolutely absent from its energy. They were not dark side users who radiated malice. They were simply nothing, a zero. They did not exist within its flow. To a Jedi's senses, the galaxy is a vibrant, shimmering tapestry of light and life and energy. A beautiful, chaotic painting. The Yuuzhan Vong were a gaping, black, silent hole torn right through the center of that tapestry. When a Jedi reached out with their mind to feel a Yuuzhan Vong warrior, they did not find anger or fear or even the cold calculus of a droid. They found nothing. A void. A chilling, absolute emptiness that sucked in perception. It gave back only a silent, screaming nullity. No thoughts, no feelings, no life force. Just a cold, dead, absolute vacancy where a living being should be. This was so much more than a mere tactical problem. It was an existential crisis that shook the Jedi Order to its core. A Jedi could not sense the trap being laid around the next corner. They could not use the Force to push a warrior off a ledge. They could not subtly influence their mind to stand down. They could not precognitively dodge their strikes. Their greatest abilities, the skills honed over a lifetime of discipline, were not just neutralized. They were rendered childish, pathetic fantasies. For the first time in their long, storied history, the Jedi were forced to fight a war completely, utterly blind. They were stumbling in the dark. They were swinging at phantoms. They were fighting an enemy that did not just ignore the rules of the universe. They seemed to have brought their own terrifying set of rules with them. This was a nightmare the Sith, for all their power, could never have conceived. The Empire was a known quantity. It was a monstrous, but understandable threat. It was a war of political power, of military might, of ideology. It was something the Jedi could analyze, fight, and conceptually understand. Its evil was absolute, but it was still contained within the known framework of the galaxy. A Jedi could feel the Emperor's darkness festering on Coruscant. It was a blazing signal fire of hatred. But the Yuuzhan Vong? They were an incomprehensible force of nature, a silent, advancing tsunami of nothingness. They were a threat that didn't just challenge the Jedi's power. It made their entire philosophy, their entire reason for being, feel meaningless. It stripped them of their identity and left them spiritually naked, adrift in a suddenly hostile, empty, and silent sea. It was the ultimate violation. It proved that everything they had ever known, everything they had ever believed in, could simply be wrong. They were not an army. They were a plague on existence itself. The sheer physical horror of the Yuuzhan Vong, however, was only the surface layer of their nightmare. The true, deeper terror was found not in what they were, but in why they did what they did. They were not driven by base greed or a simple lust for power. They were not driven by a political ambition to rule. They were driven by a terrifying, all-consuming, fanatical religious hunger. Their entire culture, from its lowest slave to its most exalted master, was engineered around a fundamental, core belief in the sacred, redemptive holiness of paying. They saw the technology of the galactic civilization, the blasters, the starships, the droids as a profound sin, an abomination of sterile machinery. They viewed the beings of the galaxy not as enemies, but as a disease, a corruption of flesh that had forgotten the true path of sacrifice. They believed, with unshakable conviction, that by inflicting excruciating pain on themselves and on others, they were performing a divine act. They were scraping the universe clean of its impurities. This absolute, unshakable fanaticism is what made them an enemy unlike any other the galaxy had ever faced. A stormtrooper might fight out of fear of his officers or misguided loyalty. A separatist droid fought because of a programmed command, but a Yuuzhan Vong warrior fought with a single, serene, holy purpose. They believed that the greatest honor, the highest achievement, was to suffer exquisitely for their cruel gods. They willingly and eagerly mutilated their own bodies in grotesque rituals to earn a higher status in their society. They would carve intricate, sacred scars onto their faces and bodies with ritual blades. They would willingly, joyfully, have their own healthy limbs amputated and replaced with squirming, living bioweapons that fed on their pain. Death was not a punishment to be feared. It was the ultimate, most holy act of devotion. It was the final sacrifice that would guarantee their place in a promised afterlife of endless, glorious suffering. This zealous willingness to die and to inflict death made them impossible to reason with, to predict, or to intimidate. You cannot negotiate with a person who believes agony is a gift and mercy is an insult. You cannot threaten a person who welcomes death as a promotion. When a Yuuzhan Vong warrior was disarmed, when a battle was clearly lost, they would not retreat. They would often end their own life in a final, devastating act of devotion. They would throw themselves directly onto a Jedi's lightsaber to stain the blade with their sacred blood. They would trigger a living organic grenade seated within their own body, seeking to take as many of the unbelievers with them as possible. And most horrifying of all, they often did it with beatific smiles on their faces, their final moments one of ecstatic triumph. This was an evil no mortal ruler, however twisted, could have imagined. A despot wants to control a galaxy, to rule its resources and its people. The Yuuzhan Vong wanted to unmake it, to tear it down and painstakingly reshape every world, every living thing into a screaming, bleeding monument to pain. Their evil was not born of ambition or hatred. It was born of a fanatical, universe-spanning belief system. That is a kind of horror that goes beyond any simple human desire for power. It is a theological nightmare, a crusade of agony with no end goal but the crusade itself. The horror, of course, did not end with their philosophy or their forced blindness. The physical, tangible presence of the Yuuzhan Vong war machine was a nightmare all its own, a visceral assault on the senses. The galaxy had seen massive armies before. It had seen the endless legions of clone troopers, the fleets of dagger-shaped star destroyers blotting out suns. It had witnessed the world-shattering firepower of a Death Star. All of these were expressions of an evil of cold, efficient, impersonal metal. It was a logical, industrial kind of terror. The Yuuzhan Vong's evil, by contrast, was a terrifying, wet, pulsating perversion of life itself. It was a biological horror show. Their ships were not built in sterile dry docks. They were not constructed of cold durasteel and transparasteel, humming with ion engines. Their ships were grown, earthed in nightmarish organic shipyards that resembled immense wombs. They were living, breathing, feeling creatures. They had vast stomachs to hold cargo and warriors, their walls slick with mucus. Their engines were massive, complex organisms that breathed superheated plasma and pulsed with a sickening rhythm. The crew weren't pilots. They were symbiotically connected to the ship's nervous system by pulsing, umbilical-like organic cables, feeling its pain, its hunger. Their vessels were grotesque, asymmetrical abominations that seemed to bleed when damaged. They were commanded not with buttons and levers, but with applications of pain, with whip-like goads that made the living ship scream and obey. The Yuuzhan Vong warriors did not wear armor of molded plastoid or plasteel. They wore suits of Von Doom, crab armor that was grown directly onto their bodies, a second skin that bonded to their flesh. This armor was a living thing. It would absorb and dissipate the energy from blaster bolts, its chitinous plates hardening in response to impact. It could heal itself over time, sealing cracks and wounds. It was not equipment. It was a symbiotic parasite that fed on its host, a constant, low-level pain that was considered a blessing. Their weapons were just as terrifying. They did not carry blasters or laser cannons. They carried living creatures, bioengineered horrors. They wielded amphistaffs, serpent-like poles that could become rigid as durasteel or whip-like and venomous in an instant. They carried thud bugs, living projectiles that hit with the force of a concussion grenade. They used razor bugs that flew in swarms to flay flesh from bone, and plague bombs that released viruses that liquefied internal organs. This was not war as the galaxy understood it. This was a grotesque, mobile infestation, a perversion of nature itself. Every single aspect of their technology was a violation of the natural order, a mockery of life that was both alien and deeply, instinctively wrong. It was a mirror of life itself, but a twisted, bleeding, and broken reflection seen through a fever dream. The Yuuzhan Vong did not build their technology. They bred it. They mutated it in vats of nutrient sludge, guided by a religion that worshipped suffering. Every single warship, every piece of armor, every weapon was a unique, horrifying monster, a testament to their grotesque artistry. This was a horror that could not be reasoned with, could not be bought off, could not be understood. It was an evil that simply existed to propagate terror and inflict pain for its own divine sake. It was a pure, physical, biological nightmare that no industrialist, however evil, could have created. That old evil was clean, sterile, and logical. The Yuuzhan Vong's evil was a chaotic, bleeding, stinking, living, and breathing horror. It was a biological weapon on a galactic scale, a crusade of butchers who used living scalpels. The Yuuzhan Vong were not a conventional enemy to be defeated in a grand final battle. They were a fundamental, existential threat. They were a race that did not play by the rules of the universe they invaded. Their evil was not a political one. It was not a mere hunger for power. It was a terrifying, three-pronged assault, a biological horror that repulsed the senses, a religious zealotry that defied reason, and a metaphysical void that crippled the galaxy's greatest defenders. They showed the galaxy that its most powerful weapon could be rendered utterly useless. They showed that pain could be a holy sacrament. They proved that death was not something to be feared, but a weapon to be wielded. Their nightmare was a physical one, a bleeding, shrieking, grotesque, living horror that showed a complacent galaxy, a deeper, older, and far more terrifying kind of darkness. But as utterly horrifying as this was, as galaxy-shattering as their invasion proved to be, it was, unbelievably, only the first nightmare. It was only the beginning, a prelude to a deeper terror. For there are other evils that go far beyond a physical, tangible threat. Evils that are not just a wound on the galaxy's surface, but a cancer in its very soul, a weeping wound in the Force itself, an abomination that predates history, the mother of all terrors, Abeloth. Chapter 2. The Origin of a Nightmare. To even begin to understand the nature of this second evil, you must first be acquainted with the most fundamental forces in existence. You must know of the ones of Mortis. In the animated series, we were granted a fleeting, terrifying glimpse into a realm beyond our own. We were introduced to three mysterious and impossibly powerful beings. There was the Father. He was an ancient entity whose sole purpose was to maintain the delicate, impossible balance of the Force itself. The Son was a being who was the raw, untamed, and seductive living embodiment of the dark side. He was a creature of passion, ambition, and rage. The daughter was his counterpart. She was the serene and resolute living embodiment of the light side. She was a being of peace, protection, and selflessness. They were not Force users. They were forces of nature given consciousness. They were, for all intents and purposes, gods, playing out an eternal drama on a stage of their own creation. They were the very heart of the Force, condensed into a single impossible location. But in the deeper, older legends of Star Wars, their story held a terrible, hidden secret. A secret they fought to keep buried for millennia. A shameful flaw in their celestial family. They were not always alone. They had a mortal servant. She was, by all accounts, a simple, compassionate woman. She cared for them. She cooked for them. She maintained their home. She was a nurturer, a mother figure to these three impossibly powerful, yet strangely dependent immortals. She was kind, she was selfless, she was everything a mortal could be in the presence of gods. But she was just that, a mortal. She aged, she weakened. She watched the family she loved exist in a state of eternal, dynamic stasis, while she slowly decayed. Over countless years, her simple desire to be a true part of their family, to never leave them, curdled into a powerful, all-consuming, and dangerous obsession. She desperately, painfully wanted to share their eternal power. She wanted to transcend her fragile flesh. She wanted to become a true immortal, a permanent, fundamental part of the Force itself. This desire festered. It became a gnawing hunger, a hunger that corrupted her very soul and led her to an act of such unspeakable arrogance, such profound violation, that it would echo through history as a catastrophe. Her desperation finally overrode all reason, all fear. She committed the ultimate sacrilege. She bypassed all warnings, all safeguards, and immersed her mortal body in the font of power. It was a wellspring of pure dark side energy. And then, seeking balance, or perhaps simply more, she drank deeply from the pool of knowledge. It was a font of pure light side energy. These were two sacred, opposing places. They were never, ever meant for a mortal being to touch. It was the ultimate forbiddance act, an act that was a profound and violent insult to the very nature of the Force. It was like forcing matter and antimatter to coexist within a single fragile vessel. Her mortal body and spirit could not handle the immense, conflicting power of these two primordial wells. It did not elevate her to godhood. It did not make her their equal. It warped her. It twisted her. It broke her on a fundamental level and reassembled the pieces into something monstrous, something never meant to be. She did not become a god. She became a screaming contradiction, a god of madness, a chaotic parasite on the body of the Force. She became the very thing she was meant to serve. And yet, she became its antithesis. She became Abeloth. The power she gained was so vast, so unstable, so wrong, that it immediately threatened to unmake the stability of Mortis. It threatened to bleed out into the wider galaxy. It would dissolve reality into a screaming chaos. She was not a person with a plan or a goal. She was a living, breathing catastrophe, a sentient wound in the Force itself, a hungry, desperate, insane virus of pure, destructive, chaotic energy. The family, these incredibly powerful beings, found they could not defeat her. They could not destroy her. They had to muster all of their eternal, celestial strength just to contain her, just to trap her. They sealed her away in a prison, not made of walls, but of concept. An eternal confinement within the center of the planet. A realm specifically designed to contain a literal, living god of chaos. This was not a victory. It was an act of sheer, desperate survival. They knew, with absolute certainty, that if this abomination ever escaped her bonds, she would not conquer. She would consume everything. She would leave only a howling, formless madness in her wake. She was a nightmare so profound it could only be buried, not defeated. For thousands of years, through the rise and fall of empires, Abeloth remained trapped. Her prison, forged by gods, held. But over the millennia, the great balance of the Force began to shudder and sway violently. The constant, escalating war between the light and the dark, the Jedi and the Sith, created a critical weakness in the metaphysical laws of her ancient prison. A tiny, hairline crack in the divine seal of her confinement. It was all she needed. Through that crack, she was able to reach out with her consciousness, a tendril of pure insanity extending into the minds of those sensitive to the Force's flow. She began to whisper, to corrupt, to seduce. She could possess the minds of the strongest Force users. She could twist their greatest virtues into terrifying flaws. She could turn them into her mindless puppets. She could use them to do her bidding. She could prepare the galaxy for her return. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was an infection spreading through the host, a psychic disease of the mind that promised power and delivered only raving insanity. Her eventual, full escape was not a battle. It was a cataclysmic event, a cosmological symptom of a galaxy terminally out of balance. Her return signaled an end to things. Her power was a terrifying, natural disaster given will. She didn't want to rule the galaxy from a throne. The concept was beneath her. She had no desire for titles or armies or political control. She wanted to absorb all of it into her own boundless, chaotic essence. She wanted to consume all of life, all of reality, to end the loneliness of her existence by making everything a part of her screaming, chaotic self. Her power was a virus that spread through the Force itself. Everyone connected to it felt the rising tide of her madness. Planets were plunged into inexplicable chaos. Jedi Masters began having waking nightmares. A sense of profound existential dread fell across the galaxy. She was a living wound that had begun to bleed into everything. This is where the true ultimate terror begins. Her power was so immense, her threat so absolute, that the eternal, sacred war between the Jedi and the Sith became instantly and laughably meaningless. Their ancient feud was a petty squabble in the face of total annihilation. The two great enemy factions, the embodiments of light and dark, knew with cold certainty that they could not defeat this thing alone. They were forced into something unthinkable, a temporary, desperate alliance. They had to stand side by side, lightsabers of blue and green alongside red, to fight a single common foe. This was the most unholy alliance imaginable. It was the only thing that could show the galaxy, and us, just how far her evil truly went. It proved that in the face of true, cosmic, existential horror, the concepts of light and dark become luxuries. There is only existence, and the thing that seeks to unmake it. The Empire, the Sith, they were a terrifying threat to the Jedi Order and to the principles of the Republic. But Abeloth was a threat to the very concepts the Sith wielded. She was a threat to both the light and the dark sides of the Force equally. She was a threat to existence itself, to the very idea of reality being stable and ordered. This was not a war for control of the galaxy's resources or its governance. It was a desperate, last-ditch battle for the preservation of reality. A fight to stop the universe from simply coming apart at the seams. It pushed every single individual involved to their absolute limits. It broke minds and spirits. Even the greatest and most wise Jedi Masters had to fight a war they could not truly comprehend. They were against an enemy that was less a being and more a natural law of entropy and madness. A war against a sentient, hungry void where the Force should be. Now we must finally, and with trepidation, look at the true, naked nature of her evil. Abeloth was not a tactical or political evil. She was not a strategic genius or a conqueror. She was an existential evil, a concept given form. She was not a person with a plan or a scheme. She was a living, breathing hunger, an emptiness that needed to be filled. She was a pure, unthinking, relentless force of nature, like a hurricane or a black hole. She was the very embodiment of chaos, not as a philosophy, but as a state of being. Her evil could not be reasoned with. It could not be bargained with. It could not be appealed to. It simply existed, a self-perpetuating engine of corruption and consumption. She was a cosmic sickness that used the Force. As its bloodstream got her power operated on a level the galaxy had never witnessed before, and has not since. She could possess the minds of the strongest Jedi Council members and most powerful Sith Lords alike. She turned them into raving prophets of her return. She could warp local reality. She could make time flow backwards. She could turn stone to water. She could render the laws of physics mere suggestions. She could command legions of her corrupted followers across light years of space with a single thought. Her will was not a command. It was an absolute, undeniable law of madness that overwrote the wills of others. She did not want to control the galaxy. The concept was absurdly small to her. She had no desire for political power. She had only an insatiable, endless, screening desire to consume all of life, all of energy, all of thought. She wanted to make the vibrant symphony of the universe a single, silent, monotonous note. Herself, her goal was not conquest. Her goal was a final, horrifying unmaking of all things. A return to the silence that preceded the Big Bang. Her hunger was a black hole in the Force, a gravitational well of madness that threatened to swallow every star, every planet, every thought, every memory into a final, absolute nothingness dot. She was a nightmare that retroactively made the galaxies. Greatest conflicts seem small, quaint, and manageable. The Clone Wars, the Galactic Civil War, these were all mortal struggles. Stories with heroes and villains and a clear, if difficult, path to victory. They were a part of the familiar cycle of rise and fall. They had a beginning, a middle, and an end. But Abeloth's nightmare had no end, only a temporary cessation. Her evil was not born from ambition or hatred or a desire for order. It was born from a fundamental brokenness in reality itself, a glitch in the cosmos. It was a cancer on existence, a sentient tumor growing on the framework of the universe. Her story is the most terrifying reminder. There are horrors lurking in the infinite depths of the universe that are far beyond any single person, any government, any army. There are evils that cannot be defeated with a lightsaber's blade, or overwhelmed with a fleet of warships. There are nightmares that are so woven into the fabric of reality, they can never be truly destroyed, only momentarily contained, buried, and forgotten. And they are always there, in the dark, silent spaces, waiting for the balance to shift, waiting for a crack to appear, waiting to be remembered. And yet, even in the face of such soul-crushing, unimaginable horrors, the spirit of life, the stubborn will to endure, found a way. The Yuuzhan Vong were finally bloodily defeated, not through superior technology alone, but through the combined, desperate will of a galaxy that simply refused to die, that refused to be unmade. The Jedi, humbled and broken, learned to adapt. They learned to fight without the Force as a crutch, to rely on their own hard-earned skill, their courage, and their bonds with each other. They learned to become a different, more resilient kind of hero. The light side found a way to fight back against a void. It proved that even ultimate emptiness cannot permanently triumph over the stubborn, defiant strength of living beings who choose to stand together. And Abeloth, the mother of madness herself, the living wound in the Force, was also defeated, not through overwhelming firepower, not through a singular act of heroism, but through that most impossible of things, an unholy alliance. The Jedi and the Sith, the two eternal, hated enemies, were forced to swallow their animosity. They had to unite their diametrically opposed powers, not to destroy her, for that proved impossible. But to once again seal her away, to mend the crack in her prison for another age. It was a temporary, tense, and fragile truce that shattered the moment the greater threat was contained. But it was ultimate proof. Even the most fundamental, existential evil can be held at bay. The light side, in its broadest definition as the will to live and to preserve, always finds a way. Not because it is the most powerful force in the universe, but because it is the most adaptable, the most persistent. Through unity in the face of oblivion, through unimaginable sacrifice, and through the sheer, stubborn ability to adapt to any horror, any rule breaker, any nightmare. The light, in the end, will always find a way to stand against the dark, because the alternative is silence.